Hey folks, thank you all for coming out. I'd like to start by acknowledging the occupied land that we're gathered on here today. And as we sit here and talk about issues of immigration, racism, labor, poverty, all of these things, I want us to remember that here, east from here, west from here, north from here, south from here, is all stolen land, and to ground ourselves with this fundamental reality. And I'd also like to honor, as Elena did, all those who have fallen and all those who have risen in the struggle for the defense of this land. I want to thank all of the organizers, everyone who's out here today. This weekend has been incredible, and so inspiring. And so thank you all for your work for Cities of Sweatshop and all the ongoing work that Known as Legal Toronto does and all of the other folks and amazing allies in this city. I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of Indigenous and immigrant solidarity and to bring some examples and perhaps mostly questions to put forward for everybody here in terms of all of the work that we do, particularly as a movement that grounds ourselves in migrant justice and also stands in firm solidarity and support of Indigenous sovereignty struggles. In particular, I want to highlight some of the things that I think that I hold very dear to me and some of the moments where this idea is no longer an abstract thing, but has become a very real reality in terms of incredibly powerful alliances that we've been able to build as part of a movement that is hopefully part of a process of decolonizing our communities, being able to decolonize our movements and reclaim some semblance of community autonomy that has been denied to us for so many centuries. So, just to start off with this idea of Canada that I'm sure we're all very well aware of, the Canada that we all spell with a KKK, in order to unravel this mythology of benevolence and multiculturalism and compassion that we're sold when we're told about Canada. And I want to quote OJ, I don't know if people know him, he was a defender during the Gustafson Lake trial in 1995 till 1999. This was the largest paramilitary operation in Canadian soil, where a group of Sundancers were laid siege in a paramilitary operation in the interior of British Columbia. During trial, one thing that OJ said about Canada was that the dangerous beast has many faces, and the one that is the most dangerous is the face that lends itself a smile to you. And that, to me, is how Canada represents itself, the beast with a smile. And we see that despite all the rhetoric of multiculturalism, the very terminology that our lives are embodied with, the very words that we are inscribed, words like immigrants, words like non-status, words like undocumented, words like non-status Indians, words like Indian itself, are all deeply racialized, colonized, colonial, imperialist terms that are forced upon us. When we think of something like a quote-unquote illegal, we do not think of all of the white Europeans, all of the white Americans, all of the British, all the Irish folks who have overstayed their tourist visas. We don't think of them. When we think of illegals, we think of brown bodies, particularly men who are scheming, who are snarkling, who are trying to thieve their ways into so-called our Canadian borders. That is who we think of. When we think of immigrants, we don't think of white settlers. We think of brown, racialized people whose roots may have been in this land for centuries, particularly the Chinese community, whose roots lie across this land for centuries, who built a lot of what so-called Canada is supposedly built on. We don't think of them because we still consider them hyphenated citizens, so-called Chinese Canadians, South Asian Canadians, Arab Canadians, Canadians who are actually not Canadian enough to be Canadian because the very idea of Canadian is a white Canadian. And when we think of folks who are migrant workers, folks who are undocumented, people in the temporary foreign worker programs, these are people who by their very definition are considered foreigners to us. People who are foreigners who do not belong, whose very legal status inscribes the fact that they will never be good enough to belong, but their labor is something that we can steal for decades. They can come decade after decade after decade, give us their lives, give us their blood, give us their sweat, but they will never be people who are part of us because they will always be people who are not of us, not with us, and not from us. And so this regulation of citizenship, again, applies to Indigenous peoples of this land, who through the Indian Act, through legislative changes since colonization, are told that they are non-status Indians, as if though the state can tell an Indigenous person that they are no longer Native, that their children are no longer Indigenous, that they no longer have enough blood within their child to say that they're a Native person. And so this idea of citizenship is something that, regardless of someone's physical location, is deemed as an outsider, as a foreigner, and again, someone who is not Canadian enough. And this is not something that's abstract for people who live this reality. This is a daily reality of violence in our daily lives. The violence of subjugation, the violence of poverty, the violence of immigration officers, the violence of the RCMP, the violence of your slumlords, the violence of the streets, the violence of having bosses that exploit you every single day, the violence of not being paid minimum wage, the violence of colonization, the violence of assimilation. All of these violences are things that our bodies bear the brunt of on every single day when we're told that we are not really of here, we do not belong here, and that the white supremacist country that is Canada is the only thing that can regulate our ability to live with dignity. And so through all of these realities, there's also the one foundational reality in terms of some of the commonalities between Indigenous people and migrants who are racialized, and that is the forces of displacement that render us as continuously displaced and displaceable. And we see that from Turtle Island to Palestine, we see that from Mexico to BC, where things like occupation, free trade agreements, the treaty process, resource extraction, power plants, dams, all of these things are forcing people off their lands and forcing people into what we are now calling the city as a sweatshop, into industries that exploit people's lives and their labor. And one of the things that stands out to me in particular every single year in Vancouver, on July 1st, so-called Dominion Day, is a day that in Vancouver is very strongly resisted, particularly by the Chinese community and the Indigenous communities in anti-Canada Day celebrations. Of course, for Indigenous people, as a rejection of the forced assimilation of Indigenous people into Canada, and for Chinese Canadian communities, because July 1st, 1923, so-called Dominion Day, is when the Head Tax Act was passed. And for the Chinese Canadian community, this is known as Humiliation Day and continues to be known as Humiliation Day. And in Vancouver, it stands for me as one of the strongest moments, again, rooted in reality of what it means to reject the idea of being a Canadian when so many communities have been dispossessed and displaced by this idea of Canada.